For those of you who are following this series, remember that what I'm telling is only the um, ancestral uh, stories about the medallion. There's a whole parallel part in the book about the medallion in modern times. So if you haven't read the series, just understand this is only half of, of this book. So we'll go on. Adzul pushed himself up against the trunk of that tree. His heart was pounding from that roar. He'd never heard anything like that in his life. He stared around in the darkness. He didn't know what to do. The river was to the side, flowing past him, but otherwise there was nothing moving in the dark. It was just starting to get a little bit light, nothing moving. But he noticed that the medallion was cool, and it gave him some reassurance because the medallion always got hot when he was in danger. Now, it made him wonder whether the medallion only got hot for human danger, but it was cool, and that reassured him a little bit. As it grew lighter and lighter and finally got to be daylight, he really had a chance to study the surroundings around him. I mean, he was in deep jungle, and there were huge trees stretching way 80, 90, 100 feet up in the air, and with branches and growth at the very top intertwining among them to form sort of a canopy of green overhead. Uh, the sun didn't get through brightly down to the floor of the jungle, and it was hot. It was hot. There were also millions of bee bugs buzzing, birds flying everywhere, beautiful birds making singing, and there were parrots and macaws, uh, which are very colorful birds. There were all kinds of activity in the jungle, and as he stayed against the tree and looked up high up in the canopy, at the very top levels, he saw a figure moving along with arms, legs, and a long tail. And it was dark, and it was about 3 feet tall, best as he could guess. And it would grab a branch and swing along, and grab another branch and swing along, uh, making its way through the canopy. And all of a sudden, this figure stopped on a branch and let out one of those roars that he had heard. It was unbelievably loud and fearsome. And he realized, of course, that it was a monkey. And he had heard his relatives who had been down off the mountains into the jungles talk about these monkeys. They called them howler monkeys because of this noise they made. It was really, if you didn't know what it was really scary. So he kind of smiled to himself, and that explained why the medallion was cool when he heard the first roar. But he was starved. He was starving. Uh, as we said, he looked terrible. He was extremely thin. He hadn't had nothing but grubs for, holy cow, for about 7 days. And he was starving. So he looked around him in the forest, and he saw here and there bushes with purple fruit, and then other bushes with what appeared to be nuts growing on them. And he noticed that monkeys came down out of the high canopy and would feed on the fruit and nuts, and they'd scamper around. Well, he standing there, some monkeys got pretty close. He noticed one bush of purple fruit about 50 yards away, and he decided fruit would have been good, but he was starving for meat. So he moved away from the trunk of the tree. As soon as he moved, all the monkeys scampered back up in the high canopy. He unwrapped the sling from his waist. There were no rocks in the dirt, in the forest dirt, but the river was right there, and he went over to the river and got 3 rocks, loaded his sling with one, and held 2 in his left hand. Then he moved uh, toward the bushes with the purple fruit, and there was a big tree about 15 yards away from that group of bushes, and it had sort of a place where he could stand against the trunk, and kind of there were bits of the trunk came out on either side of his shoulders, and so he was sort of hidden. So we went over there, and he didn't try to disguise his movement. The monkeys were long gone. He didn't try to disguise anything. He walked over there and moved himself so he was standing with his back to that tree trunk, and he shortened the sling so the pouch rested on the ground with his right hand down at his side. And it was only, it wasn't very long. It would not give him a full 5 foot swing. It might give him 2 to 3 foot of a swing, and he just hoped he could get enough power into it to throw the rock. And he stood there for an hour. No monkeys came down. Now they moved around. They kind of ignored him. He was absolutely still. And animals spot movement, so he didn't move. They didn't spot anything, and they were scampering around way, 80 feet high up in the canopy. Another hour went by. His legs were shaking from exhaustion and from weakness, and he was just about to step out and go get some of that fruit for himself when he noticed 3 howler monkeys settle in the tree above these bushes and then start to make their way down. He didn't move, and he didn't look directly at them. He kept his eyes averted so he wouldn't make eye contact with them. And 15 minutes went by, and they made their way slowly down, and another 15 minutes went by, and they got to the bushes and settled in the bushes, plucking this purple fruit. He still didn't move because the way they were positioned on the bushes, they were facing him. And he just didn't dare move with them looking, with their heads looking in his direction. They were plucking the fruit and everything, and they moved around for another 5 or 10 minutes plucking fruit, and all of a sudden one of them turned its back to him. And Adzul waited until that monkey was putting a piece of fruit in its mouth, its back to him, and then he took 2 quick steps away from the trunk of the tree and started the sling going. The other 2 monkeys were facing him, and they screamed as soon as he moved and started for the canopy. But the 3rd monkey was a little bit behind them because it hadn't visually seen him. And it started to go, and he only had time for 2 revolutions of the sling, and he let the rock go, and it hit that 3rd monkey about 15 feet above the bushes, right in the back of the head. and it did a somersault and crashed to the ground, and he was on it. In spite of the fact how weak he was on it with a rock in his hand, holding it down. He was going to kill it with a rock. It was dead already. His sling throw had been perfectly accurate. And in a very few minutes, monkey meat was roasting over a fire. The energy that the meat and the fruit, because he went and got some fruit and nuts, the energy it gave him was extraordinary. And he spent the rest of the day hunting and got several more monkeys. And now he had food to sustain him. 3 weeks went by while he hunted in that area right near the river. And he collected monkeys for food. He skinned them. He made sandals for himself out of monkey skin. He made a headband of black and white monkey skin to hold his hair in place to replace the red headband that had been lost when he went over the waterfall. And in the front of the headband, he put two toucan feathers in a V sticking up from the front of the headband. And that was the mark of an Inca warrior. And his body filled out, and strength came back, body filled out. He used the cloak. It was bloody hot in the jungle, and he used the cloak to make a big sack. And in it, he put the shredded remains of the tunic, which had been really trashed that first day on the rocks and dirt coming off the waterfall. And he took off, finally got comfortable enough, because the medallion never got hot, to take off his armor shirt and put it in the sack. And he carried it around with him, and he spent 3 weeks recovering. And at the end of 3 weeks, he set off with his sack. Really, he had his feet had recovered. There were scars from the cuts and bruises that they had taken coming off the mountain, but his feet had recovered. He made some pretty darn good sandals and some extra pairs of sandals. But the ground of the jungle was pretty soft, so it wasn't like walking on the rocks and dirt of the high mountains. So he had sandals, and he had a sack, and he had plenty of dried monkey meat and fruit, and he headed north away from the river. And the jungle, parts of the jungle were really, it was pretty neat, because it was like a green light all around him, because the sun was blocked by the canopy overhead. So it was like a green light, and there were, as I said, there were birds and insects and everything. And one of the things he loved was all the butterflies. He loved the butterflies. Hadn't seen many butterflies up in the high mountains, but he loved them. There were all different kinds of colored butterflies, some little ones, some big ones with reds and blues and blacks and oranges, and they fluttered around the bushes, and he absolutely loved watching them. So he headed north, and about 4 or 5 days after he left the river, he was going along the side of a swamp, and he heard a squealing noise. And it sounded like the squealing of a capybara, which is kind of like a pig-like animal. And he stopped, and the squealing was not far away, and it was squealing loudly. And then the squeals got lower, or that is, they got quieter and quieter, and all of a sudden he heard a distinct crunch, and the squealing stopped. So he very carefully made his way into the shallow water of the swamp, and he hadn't gone maybe 40, 50 feet when he saw a capybara lying in the water, about 150-pound capybara, not small. And around it were two huge, thick, green coils. And as he watched, the coils moved, and he realized they belonged to a giant snake. And in a minute or two, a huge head appeared out of the water and undergrowth. And the snake opened its jaws really, really wide and grabbed the head of the capybara, and the snake's teeth were pointed backward, and it would slide its head a little bit forward up the capybara's snout and head, and the teeth, the backward pointing teeth, would hold it in place. Then it'd slide its head a little further, and its jaws distended, that is, separated, and this big pig-like capybara started disappearing into the snake. Adzul gave a shudder and backed away, making note to be darn careful, to look out in the swamp areas whenever he had to be in a swamp, to be watchful for the snakes. It was a week or 10 days later when he was moving through the forest quietly, but just moving, traveling along, when the medallion got hot. Quickly got hot. And he stopped, instantly stopped, and slid slightly sideways till he was hidden by a bush. And he looked straight ahead. And about 50, 60 yards in front of him, he saw a man bent over, slightly bent over, at least his knees bent, and he had a bow and arrow. And the bow was pulled back at full stretch. And he had brown skin and a loincloth. That's all he had. That's all he was wearing, and black hair. And he was looking in front of him down at the ground. And his bow was at full pull. And all of a sudden, he released an arrow, what seemed to be straight into the ground. And Adzul watched, and the guy reached down and grabbed the arrow and lifted it up, and on the end of the arrow was a big, struggling fish, which he killed, whacked it on the head and killed it. Two more men appeared from the right, slapped him on the back, and all three of them moved to the left along what Adzul guessed now was some kind of water, moving water. So he waited, and the medallion started to cool. And in 45, 50 minutes, the medallion had cooled. It was normal temperature, was cool against his chest. So he eased forward very, very carefully until he could see what the guy had been doing. And sure enough, there was a big, wide, muddy river. And the guy had been in the river. Adzul couldn't have seen that from where he first spotted him, but he'd been maybe, ankle, knee deep in the river hunting fish. And as Adzul was checking this out, he stayed pretty far back in the forest. All of a sudden, the medallion got hot, and he froze, and two canoes of men went down the river from his left to his right. And he could see weapons sticking out of the bows and arrows and spears and a funny long tubular weapon of some kind sticking off above the edge of the boats. The boats were quite low to the water. So as soon as they were gone, he turned around. He realized that upstream to the left, there must be a village or town or something. And he also realized that these people were not friendly. So he retraced his steps back deep, deep, deep into the forest until he was 200-300 yards away from the river. And then he started making his way to the left, hoping to come behind the village and be able to keep on going north, which he did. And about mid-afternoon, he smelled smoke, and the medallion got hot, and he backed into the jungle and kept moving very, very carefully. And peering out through the foliage, he saw planted fields and people working in the fields, farmers working in the fields. And beyond them, toward the river, were some whitish huts and apparently, clearly a community. So he backed even further away and kept going. And the medallion was hot. He knew these people weren't friendly, so the medallion was hot. He kept going to the side, deep, deep, deep in the jungle, and the medallion finally cooled. And all afternoon, he made his way to the left before he started, which would have been to the west, before he started north again. Finally, he judged the medallion was totally cool. He judged he could head north and hopefully catch the river, because he suspected there might be a path along the river that he could move really quickly on. And it took him 45, 50 minutes of very slow going, and finally he could see the river. But the medallion got warm, so he stopped and stayed hidden in the jungle. It didn't get hot, but it got warm. And he watched the river, and he figured probably the medallion was warm because of boats either going up the river or coming down the river. But he didn't see any. And he waited for an hour, didn't see any. The medallion never got hot, it just got warm. So finally he took a chance and eased forward, and sure enough, just as he suspected, there was a path along the river. And he turned left on the path going upstream and started trotting at a pace like the Inca could run, slowly run, that ate up the miles. And he followed the path, putting as much distance between him and the village as he could. What he didn't notice, because he never looked up, was high, high up in one of the trees at the edge of the river, right where he'd come out to get on the path, there was a young boy, way, 70 feet up in the air, looking for honey from beehives. And he had found a beehive full of honey, and he had been just about to drop the hive to the ground when Adzul stepped out, turned left, and started running up the path. The boy got a big smile on his face, forgot about the honey, and started, after Adzul was out of sight, started scrambling down the tree. There would be a big reward in it for him for reporting an enemy to the village. So Adzul uh, ran on, and uh, the medallion stayed cool, and he ran all that afternoon. And he put a lot of distance between himself and the village. He finally, it got to be dark. The medallion was cool, but he wasn't taking any chances. So he went into the jungle and collected some enormous leaves, enormous 3 foot long, a whole bunch of leaves, big green leaves. Cut them off bushes and stuff. And he got way, way off the trail and covered himself with leaves and settled in to sleep. The medallion was cool. Now, just before he went to sleep, he heard a roar out in the jungle, a faint roar. And he had heard this before during the 3 weeks that he was recovering by the river where he first came out of the mountains. And it was not a howler monkey roar. It was a different roar. And every time he heard it on those first 3 weeks, he built up his little fire. He woke up, when it would wake him up, and the medallion would get faintly warm, and he would get up, build his little fire up, and then back off into the darkness away from the fire, so that if anything approached the fire, he would see it, but he wouldn't be seen. Nothing happened. But as he settled in under this leaves that he had spread around all over him, just before he went to sleep, he heard a roar deep in the forest, deep in the jungle. And he once again wondered, what the heck was it? Because it was not a howler monkey. What the heck was it that made that? And he remembered stories of traders who would come down into the jungle from the Inca cities up in way high up in the mountains. He remembered stories of traders who had mysteriously disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to them. He remembered those stories. Anyway, he was tired, and he shut his eyes and instantly went to sleep. The burning medallion woke him up. It was really hot against his chest. He had laid down against a tree with a lot of vines falling off it, and then covered himself with all these leaves. So he was right against a tree trunk. He didn't move a muscle. And then he smelled human sweat. And there was the slightest rustle of a leaf 2 feet away. He realized there was a man there hunting him. And that's where we're going to end today's episode. If you are in the mode of writing, even if you know the story from having read the book or having told it to you in a classroom, put your imagination to work and figure out what happens next and write it down. Tomorrow, you'll hear my ending.